They called it the black magic of Daytona. It was a machine that shouldn't have existed, built by a man who didn't believe in the word impossible, only in the phrase, "show me where it says I can't." In the sweltering heat of the 1966 NASCAR season, while factory teams were pouring millions into massive big block engines that shook the ground, one man in a mysterious garage in Florida was doing something much quieter and far more dangerous. He wasn't building a bomb. He was building a mirror that would reflect the establishment's own arrogance back at them. This isn't just a story about a car that went fast. It is the story of a ghost. A Chevrolet Chevelle that technically followed every single letter of the law while violating the spirit of the sport so violently that it forced the most powerful organization in racing to rewrite their entire reality. This is the chronicle of the engine they couldn't measure, the mechanic they couldn't control, and the shocking truth behind the weapon that silenced NASCAR. To understand why this car was such a threat, you have to understand the battlefield of the mid-1960s. This was the golden age of horsepower, but it was also the age of the sledgehammer. Ford and Chrysler were engaged in an arms race of cubic inches. If you wanted to win on the high-banked ovals of Daytona or Atlanta, the accepted wisdom was that you needed displacement. You needed a massive 427 cubic inch monster that gulped fuel and churned out torque like a locomotive. The rulebook was written for these giants. The philosophy was simple: bigger is better, and biggest is best. But Henry Smokey Yunick didn't care about accepted wisdom. He operated out of a facility that became a place of pilgrimage and fear for the rest of the racing world: the best damn garage in town. That wasn't just a slogan painted on the side of his building. It was a challenge. Inside those walls, the air smelled of ozone, welding fumes, and rebellion. Smokey looked at the massive big blocks dominating the grid and saw something the factory engineers missed. He saw waste. He saw inefficiency. He saw heavy, lumbering beasts that were fast in a straight line, but suffered from heat soak, weight balance issues, and massive parasitic loss. He decided to bring a knife to a gunfight, but he sharpened that knife until it could cut through the fabric of the rulebook itself. His weapon of choice was the Chevrolet 327 cubic inch small block. On paper, it was a joke. Bringing a 327 to race against 427 Hemis and Ford big blocks was like bringing a violently angry badger to fight a grizzly bear. The displacement gap was enormous. The power deficit theoretically should have been insurmountable. The racing press laughed. The factory teams from Ford and Chrysler didn't even blink. They barely considered it a nuisance. They looked at the small block Chevy as a grocery getter engine, something you found in your neighbor's station wagon or a base model Corvette, not a serious contender for the Grand National Series. But they didn't know what Smokey knew. They were looking at the engine's size. Smokey was looking at its soul. The origin of this underestimated miracle goes back to a different kind of visionary, a man named Ed Cole. Long before Smokey got his grease-stained hands on it, Cole, the chief engineer at Chevrolet, birthed the small block concept with a specific goal: elegant density. Cole wanted an engine that was physically small but structurally capable of enduring immense stress. When the 327 was introduced in 1962, it was the perfection of this idea. It had a 4-inch bore and a 3¼ inch stroke. For the non-engineers listening, that ratio is the holy grail. It meant the engine was over-square. The wide bore allowed for massive valves to suck in air, while the short stroke meant the pistons didn't have to travel as far with each revolution. This reduced friction and allowed the engine to scream at RPMs that would send a big block piston flying through the hood. Smokey Yunick looked at Ed Cole's design and realized that the factory had left incredible potential on the table. The 327 wasn't weak, it was just sleeping. While the rest of the grid was obsessed with making engines bigger, Smokey became obsessed with making an engine smoother. And I don't mean smooth like a luxury car. I mean smooth like a bullet moving through a vacuum. He began a forensic dissection of the 327 that bordered on madness. He didn't just build the engine, he blueprinted it to tolerances that NASA would have found acceptable. He realized that horsepower wasn't just about how much fuel you could burn, but how much energy you could save from being wasted. Every engine has parasitic losses: friction from the piston rings, resistance from the oil sloshing around the crankshaft, heat lost through the cylinder walls. Smokey declared war on friction. He started with the block itself. He smoothed out the internal oil galleries, grinding away the rough casting flash left over from the factory so the oil could return to the pan faster. He designed a complex windage tray, a piece of metal that sits inside the oil pan to scrape excess oil off the spinning crankshaft. This sounds minor, but at 7,000 RPM, a crankshaft wading through a pool of oil loses significant horsepower just trying to spin. Smokey freed that horsepower. He wasn't adding power, he was liberating it. He polished the combustion chambers until they were mirrors, preventing hot spots that could cause detonation. He balanced the rotating assembly, the pistons, rods, and crank, not to within a gram, but to within tenths of a gram. When he was done, the engine didn't vibrate. It hummed. It had a harmonic signature that was distinct, a high-pitched shriek that sounded nothing like the guttural roar of the Fords. But the engine was only half the equation. The car it sat in, that black and gold Chevelle, was about to become the subject of the most intense scrutiny in racing history. Smokey read the NASCAR rulebook differently than everyone else. Most people read it to see what they were allowed to do. Smokey read it to find the white space. If the rulebook said the fuel tank could hold 22 gallons, Smokey agreed. He put in a 22-gallon tank. But the rulebook didn't say anything about the fuel line. It didn't specify the diameter or the length of the hose running from the tank to the engine. So Smokey installed a fuel line that was practically a garden hose, coiling it through the interior of the car like a snake. It was perfectly legal. It wasn't a tank. But that line held gallons of extra fuel, allowing him to stay out on the track while the big blocks, thirsty and heavy, had to pit for gas. It was this kind of lateral thinking that made him dangerous. He wasn't breaking the rules, he was exposing their incompleteness. As the 1966 season approached, the whispers started. People had seen the Chevelle testing. They saw the stopwatch times, and they didn't believe them. It wasn't possible. A small block couldn't pull those times at a superspeedway. The physics didn't make sense. They assumed his stopwatches were broken, or he was short-cutting the track. But then came Daytona. Then came Atlanta. The transport truck arrived, the back door lowered, and the black number 13 rolled out into the sunlight. The paddock went quiet. It looked like a Chevelle, but it sat differently. It looked predatory. It looked like it was moving even when it was parked. The inspectors descended on it like vultures, tape measures in hand, ready to find the cheat. They measured the wheelbase, legal. They measured the roof height, legal. They measured the engine displacement, exactly 327 cubic inches. They scratched their heads. They couldn't find it. They knew something was wrong. They could feel it in their gut. But the rulebook, their Bible, said the car was clean. Smokey stood by the car, chewing on a cigar, wearing that battered cowboy hat, watching them with a look of pure, unadulterated amusement. He knew something they didn't. He knew that the car they were looking at was an illusion. He had applied the same philosophy to the bodywork that he had applied to the engine. He knew that air was just another form of friction. The rulebook had templates, metal cutouts that were placed over the car to ensure it matched the factory shape. But templates only check specific points. Between those points, reality was flexible. Smokey had subtly altered the mounting points of the body on the frame. The car was slightly narrower, slightly lower, and pitched forward in a way that cut through the air with significantly less drag than a factory car. He had created a shape that cheated the wind, and because the wind couldn't read the rulebook, it worked. When that black Chevelle hit the high banks of Atlanta, the sound was the first thing that told you something was wrong. In 1966, a NASCAR grid sounded like a thunderstorm, a low, rumbling bass frequency generated by 7-liter engines churning at moderate RPMs. It was a guttural, earth-shaking noise. But when Smokey's car tore down the straightaway, it cut through that bass like a siren. It didn't rumble, it screamed. The 327 was spinning at engine speeds that made other crew chiefs wince. While the big blocks were shifting at 5,800 or 6,000 RPM, the Yunick Chevelle was singing past 7,000, climbing toward a red line that would have turned a standard factory piston into shrapnel. It was a harmonic wail, a mechanical banshee that signaled the arrival of a new philosophy. On the track, the physics of the situation began to play out in real time. The big block cars had the brute force. On the long straightaways, the sheer torque of the 427s and Hemis would allow them to pull ahead, muscling their way through the air. But torque comes with a penalty: weight. A big block engine is a massive lump of cast iron sitting over the front wheels. In the corners, that weight wants to keep going straight. The drivers had to wrestle the cars, scrubbing off speed to get the nose to turn, fighting the laws of momentum with every lap. Smokey's Chevelle was different. The small block was significantly lighter, hundreds of pounds stripped off the nose of the car. It wasn't just about acceleration, it was about agility. As the pack dove into turn one, you could see the difference. The heavy Fords and Mopars would drift up the track, their tires screaming for grip, the drivers sawing at the wheel. The black number 13 just stuck. It carved the inside line with surgical precision. It carried momentum through the corner that the other cars simply couldn't match. Smokey had weaponized the center of gravity. He knew that a race wasn't won on the straights, it was won in the transition from the straight to the corner. While the big engines had to decelerate, the 327 kept singing. It was the classic tortoise and hare scenario, only the tortoise was strapped to a rocket and the hare was overweight. Behind the scenes, the panic in the rival pits was palpable. Crew chiefs for the factory-backed teams were staring at their stopwatches, shaking them, tapping the glass, assuming they were broken. "That's a 327, they'd mutter. "That motor gives up 100 cubic inches to us. It physically cannot be lapping that fast." But it was. And the secret wasn't just in the weight, it was in the thermal management. This is where Smokey's genius went from mechanical to almost biological. He treated the engine like a living organism that needed to be kept comfortable to perform. Most builders focused on getting air in. Smokey focused on heat. He knew that a hot engine loses power. The big blocks were thermal nightmares, generating massive amounts of waste heat that soaked into the intake manifolds, expanding the air and making it less dense. Smokey reworked the internal water passages of the 327 with an obsessive level of detail. He smoothed out the flow of coolant, ensuring that the cylinder heads, the hottest part of the engine, received priority cooling. He kept the temperatures stable lap after lap. While the competition's engines slowly heat-soaked and lost 10, 20, maybe 30 horsepower over the course of a 500-mile race, the Yunick 327 made the same power on lap 400 as it did on lap 1. He was winning the war of attrition before the race was even halfway done. This consistency was devastating. It meant the driver didn't have to nurse the car. They could drive it flat out, lap after grueling lap. The establishment was being humiliated. Here were teams with budgets that dwarf Smokey's, backed by the largest corporations in America, getting run down by a guy in a cowboy hat working out of a garage in Daytona Beach. It was an optical illusion that broke their brains. They looked at the car and saw a Chevelle, but Smokey hadn't built a Chevelle. He had built a prototype that looked like a Chevelle. The rumors of cheating started to fly almost immediately. But cheating is a clumsy word. It implies breaking a rule. Smokey viewed it as interpreting the rules. For example, the aerodynamic advantages of the car were subtle but profound. The rulebook specified that the car had to fit the manufacturer's templates, but the templates of 1966 were primitive. They checked the profile of the roof and the hood. Smokey realized that if he modified the suspension mounting points, he could tuck the wheels further into the body. This reduced the frontal area. He then tweaked the body panels, not enough to be caught by the naked eye, but enough to change how the air flowed over the fenders. He effectively shrank the car in the wind tunnel of reality. It was cleaner, sleeker, and slipperier than anything else on the grid. He also played games with the floor pan. The rules said the floor had to be stock, but who defines stock orientation? Smokey cut the floor out and welded it back in, but he raised it slightly, channeling air underneath the car more efficiently to create downforce, a concept that was in its infancy in stock car racing. He was applying aerospace principles he learned working on B-17 bombers in World War II to a dirt track sport. The car was a rolling physics lesson that the rest of the class was failing. The tension reached a boiling point. The factory reps were in the ears of the NASCAR officials, demanding action. Do something about that car, they demanded. He's making a mockery of the sport. They claimed he was running an illegal engine size. They claimed he was using illegal fuel additives. They claimed he had hidden nitrous oxide lines in the frame rails. The paranoia was rampant. Every time Smokey's car passed a Ford, a conspiracy theory was born. But Smokey loved it. He fed on their paranoia. He knew that if they were looking for nitrous bottles or oversized pistons, they weren't looking at the real tricks. The windage trays, the polished oil returns, the aerodynamic tucks. He was a magician, distracting them with his left hand while his right hand picked their pockets. But the establishment doesn't like to be embarrassed. NASCAR was and is a business. They needed the manufacturers happy. Ford and Chrysler threatening to pull out because a privateer was beating them was a nightmare scenario for the sanctioning body. The order came down from the top. Find something. Anything. The car had to be stopped. It wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about order. They couldn't allow a rogue element to destabilize the hierarchy of speed. The scrutiny that was about to descend on that black Chevelle would make a criminal investigation look like a casual glance. They were going to tear that car apart bolt by bolt until they found the ghost in the machine. Smokey saw them coming. He saw the grim faces of the tech inspectors, led by men who had grown tired of his smirk. He saw the jealousy in the eyes of the other team owners, and in that moment, he made a decision. If they wanted a show, he would give them a show. He wouldn't just let them inspect the car. He would turn the inspection itself into a piece of performance art that would be talked about for 50 years. He was about to pull a stunt that would define his legacy, a moment of defiance so brazen, so undeniably clever that it would transcend the sport and become folklore. The inspection wars were about to begin, and Smokey Yunick had one final ace up his sleeve, hidden where no one thought to look, right out in the open. The inspection bay at a NASCAR track is usually a place of routine bureaucracy. It is a garage filled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, the clinking of metal tools, and the low murmur of officials checking boxes on clipboards. But on this day, the atmosphere was different. It was heavy. It felt less like a vehicle inspection and more like a criminal interrogation. The black Chevelle sat in the center of the bay, surrounded by men who looked like they were trying to defuse a bomb. These weren't just low-level inspectors. These were the heavy hitters of NASCAR's technical department, men whose entire careers were built on the premise that they could catch a cheater. And right now, the cheater was standing in the corner, leaning against a toolbox, tipping his hat back and watching them with the patience of a shark waiting for the tide to turn. They started with the engine. They were convinced, absolutely certain, that the secret lay inside the block. They believed Smokey had found a way to stroke the engine, to bore it out beyond the legal limit, to hide cubic inches in the metal itself. They pulled the cylinder heads. They mic'd the bore. It measured exactly 4.00 inches. They measured the stroke, exactly 3.25 inches. They checked the valves, the springs, the lifters. They ran bore gauges down into the cylinders looking for inconsistencies. They found nothing. The engine was a legal 327. It was cleaner than the rulebook required. The frustration in the room began to rise. You could see it in their body language, the way they threw their rags down, the way they whispered aggressively to one another. They knew the car was faster than it should be. The stopwatch didn't lie, but the metal wasn't confessing. They moved to the chassis. They measured the wheelbase again. They checked the tread width. They put the car on the scales. It met the minimum weight requirement to the ounce. They were looking for lead shot hidden in the frame rails. They were looking for acid-dipped body panels that were paper thin. They tapped on the fenders, listening for the tinny sound of cheating. Solid steel. Smokey had anticipated this. He hadn't cheated by making the car light in illegal ways. He had cheated by putting the weight exactly where he wanted it, balancing the car so perfectly that it didn't need to be illegal to be fast. The inspectors were running out of options. They were running out of patience, and Smokey was just smiling. Then they turned their attention to the fuel system. This was the flashpoint. The officials were convinced that Smokey was running an oversized fuel tank. In endurance racing, fuel is time. If you can stay out on the track for 5 extra laps while your competition pits, you win. The rule stated the tank could hold a maximum of 22 gallons. The officials demanded the tank be removed. They wanted to measure it physically, to pour water into it and verify the volume down to the milliliter. This was it. The moment they thought they would catch him, they ordered Smokey to drop the tank. He didn't argue. He didn't fight.
He simply nodded to his crew. They unbolted the straps, disconnected the lines, and pulled the heavy steel tank out of the trunk, setting it on the concrete floor with a thud. The inspectors swarmed the tank, measuring it, filling it, checking for hidden bladders or expansion tricks. While they were distracted by the metal box on the floor, Smokey climbed into the driver's seat of the Chevelle. The car had no gas tank. The fuel lines were dangling in the trunk area, disconnected. The inspection was technically over. They had stripped the car of its fuel source. Smokey turned the key. The starter motor whined for a fraction of a second, and then, impossibly, the 327 roared to life. The sound in that enclosed concrete garage was deafening, a sharp, barking idle that echoed off the walls. The inspectors froze. They dropped their clipboards. They stared at the car in disbelief. It was a physical impossibility. A car cannot run without gas. A car cannot run without a tank. But there was the Chevelle, idling smoothly, the fan belt spinning, the exhaust pulsing with life. Smokey put the car in gear, gave a casual wave to the stunned officials, and drove the car out of the inspection bay, down the pit lane, and back to his hauler. He drove it without a gas tank. The trick was so simple, so brazen that it bordered on art. Smokey had read the rulebook section on fuel systems. It specified the size of the tank. It said nothing about the size of the fuel line. Smokey had installed a fuel line that was nearly 2 inches in diameter and 11 feet long, snaking it back and forth through the interior of the car before it reached the engine. It wasn't a line, it was a reservoir. That massive hose held nearly 2 gallons of gasoline, enough to start the car, idle it, and drive it for miles. It was a loophole big enough to drive a Chevelle through, and he had done exactly that.
The fuel line incident became an instant legend. It was the moment the establishment realized they weren't dealing with a mechanic, they were dealing with a philosopher of speed. Smokey hadn't technically broken the rule. The tank was legal, the line wasn't regulated, but he had violated the sanctity of their control. He had made them look foolish, and in the world of professional racing, making the officials look foolish is the only unforgivable sin. The silence in the inspection bay after he left was the silence of a system realizing it was obsolete. They knew right then and there that the current rulebook was dead. They couldn't govern a man like this with vague guidelines. But the fuel line was just the headline. The real terror for NASCAR was what they didn't find. They knew about the fuel line now because he had shown them, but what about the engine? What about the aerodynamics? What about the suspension geometry? If he was bold enough to drive a car without a gas tank in front of their faces, what was he hiding inside the engine block that they couldn't see with their bore gauges? Paranoia set in. The other teams were furious. They demanded a ban. They demanded that the car be disqualified, crushed, erased. They argued that even if it followed the letter of the law, it made a mockery of the sport. NASCAR was in a bind. If they banned a car that was technically legal, they admitted that their rules were broken. If they let it race, they admitted that a privateer could outsmart the factories. They were trapped. Smokey had checkmated them. The shocking truth wasn't that the car was illegal. The shocking truth was that the car was a mirror exposing the incompetence of the regulations. Smokey had proven that the 327, a weak engine, could beat the giants if you simply removed the stupidity from the car's design. The fallout was immediate and draconian. The officials couldn't beat him in the garage, so they went to the office. They pulled out their typewriters. They didn't just issue a penalty, they began to draft a new constitution for the sport. The era of innocent until proven guilty in racing was over. The era of, if it doesn't say you can't, then you can, was dying. Smokey Yunick had pushed the system too far, and the system was about to push back with the weight of a sledgehammer. The 1966 season would be the last gasp of true, unbridled creativity. What was coming next wasn't a race, it was a regulation. The ban was coming. But it wouldn't be called a ban. It would be called the 1967 Rulebook, a document written specifically, line by line, to ensure that a ghost like the 327 Chevelle could never haunt them again. The 1967 NASCAR Rulebook arrived on the desks of race teams like a declaration of martial law. It was thicker,
heavier and colder than any document that had come before it. It wasn't just an update, it was a targeted assassination of creativity. While the previous year's regulations had been open guidelines, fences with plenty of holes for a clever fox to slip through, the new book was a solid concrete wall. Every page seemed to have the invisible signature of Smokey Yunick written in the margins. It was a list of thou shalt nots, directly inspired by the black Chevelle that had embarrassed them at Daytona and Atlanta. The first casualty was the fuel system. The days of interpreting tank versus line were over. The new rules were agonizingly specific. Fuel lines were now restricted to a maximum diameter, standard, narrow sizes that could barely hold a cup of gasoline, let alone 2 gallons. They had to be routed in specific ways, visible and measurable. The era of the 11-foot snake was dead. But they didn't stop there. They went after the bodywork with a vengeance. The templates, once simple profiles, became rigid, full-body cages. Cars were no longer allowed to be optimized for air. They had to match the factory silhouette to within fractions of an inch. If a fender was slightly lower, if a roofline was slightly tucked, the car didn't run. The smoky tucks that had allowed the Chevelle to slice through the air were outlawed. Aerodynamics was no longer an art form, it was a compliance issue. But the most dangerous addition to the rulebook wasn't a measurement, it was a phrase. For the first time, NASCAR began to aggressively enforce the concept of the spirit of the rules. This was the ultimate weapon. It meant that even if a mechanic found a loophole that wasn't technically written down, the officials could disqualify the car simply because they felt it violated the intent of the sport. It was the death of the clever outlaw. It handed absolute power to the inspectors. If they couldn't find the cheat with a ruler, they could find it with a feeling. For a man like Smokey, who viewed the rulebook as a contract to be negotiated, this was the end of the world. He wasn't being beaten by engineering, he was being beaten by bureaucracy. The impact on the Chevy 327 was immediate and catastrophic. The engine that had punched above its weight was suddenly shackled. The new rules stripped away the clever efficiency tricks that allowed it to compete with the big blocks. Without the advantage of superior aerodynamics, without the ability to manage heat through creative plumbing, and without the fuel mileage tricks, the 327 was just a small engine in a big world. The physics finally caught up. In a fair fight, a sterilized, regulated, conformist fight, displacement wins. The big blocks from Ford and Chrysler and Chevy's own 427 took over. The grid became a procession of brute force. The delicate, screaming harmony of the high-revving small block was drowned out by the thunder of 7-liter monsters. Smokey Yunick saw the writing on the wall. He was bitter, and rightfully so. He famously said, "They didn't beat me on the track. They beat me in the office. They made the rules I raced by, then changed them when I won." It was a profound statement on the nature of innovation. The establishment loves innovation only when it comes from the establishment. When it comes from an outsider, from a guy in a garage who didn't go to their meetings and didn't shake their hands, it looks like a threat. Smokey wasn't just racing cars, he was racing against a mindset. And while the cars could be beaten, the mindset was invincible. The 327 faded from the Grand National Series, replaced by the 350 and the big blocks. It returned to the streets where it became a legend in its own right, the engine of the Camaro, the Nova, the hot rodder's dream. But it never again reached the heights it achieved under Smokey's hand. It became a domesticated animal, a great engine, but no longer a weapon of war. Smokey turned his attention to IndyCar, to turbocharged engines, to other places where his mind could run free, but the scar of the 1966 season remained. So, what is the shocking truth behind the disappearance of the secret 327? It isn't a mechanical failure. It isn't that the engine wasn't good enough. The truth is that the engine was too good for the system that contained it. It exposed the fragility of the sport. It proved that a single brilliant mind could outwork a corporation. And that is a terrifying thought for a corporation. NASCAR didn't kill the 327 because it was slow. They killed it because it was dangerous. They killed it to save themselves from the chaos of unchecked genius. Decades later, we look back at that black number 13 Chevelle, not as a cheater's car, but as a monument. It sits in the history books like a monolith. It represents the last moment of the Wild West in racing, the final time a human being mattered more than the computer simulation. Today, racing is a science of thousands. The cars are identical, the engines are spec, the drivers are data analysts. We have safety, we have parity, and we have closeness. But we have lost the ghost. We have lost the possibility that someone, somewhere, is building something in a shed that will turn the world upside down. Smokey Yunick died in 2001, but in a way he is still laughing. Every time a crew chief tries to argue a penalty, every time a team tries to bend a side skirt just a millimeter too far, they are praying to the saint of the gray area. They are chasing the ghost of the 327. The car may be gone, the rules may be rewritten, and the garage may be closed, but the idea remains. The idea that if you look hard enough, if you think deeply enough, and if you are brave enough to ignore the word impossible, you can make a mouse roar like a lion. That is the legacy of the secret Chevy 327. It wasn't just an engine, it was a question asked at 7,000 RPM. Are you racing to follow the rules, or are you racing to win? Smokey knew his answer. Do you know yours?